The sound came first. A sharp, violent rip, fabric tearing under force, loud enough to slice through the stunned silence of the classroom. Gasps followed instantly. 27 students froze in their seats as the girl at the front of the room staggered backward, her hands flying to her chest. The blue dress she'd ironed so carefully that morning now hung unevenly, torn from the shoulder seam straight down, exposing her collarbone and shaking hands beneath it. "Don't you dare dress like this in my classroom," the teacher snarled, her voice dripping with contempt. "Trying to get attention again, are we?" The girl's name was Amara Johnson. She was 14 years old, and in that moment every eye in the room burned into her like a brand. Amara's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe, not because the classroom was hot, but because humiliation had wrapped itself around her chest like a steel clamp. Her skin prickled as whispers erupted, some students laughing nervously, others staring in horror, a few pulling out their phones before quickly pretending not to. "Miss Carter, please," Amara whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is my school uniform." Miss Evelyn Carter stepped closer, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She towered over Amara, lips curled in a cruel smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Uniform?" Miss Carter scoffed loudly. "That cheap thing. Please, girls like you are always pushing boundaries, always playing the victim when someone finally calls you out." A few students shifted uncomfortably. One boy in the back lowered his head. A girl near the window bit her lip, clearly wanting to speak, but no one did, because Miss Carter wasn't just any teacher. She was powerful, protected, untouchable. Amara's fingers trembled as she tried to pull the torn fabric together. Her cheeks burned with shame, tears blurring her vision. She searched the room desperately for help, any sign of kindness, but found only silence. "Stand up straight," Miss Carter barked, "and stop that sniveling. If you wanted respect, you should have learned how to dress properly." I followed the dress code," Amara said softly, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "My mom checked it last night." At the mention of her mother, Miss Carter's expression darkened. "Oh, I'm sure she did," she said sarcastically. "I've met parents like yours before. Always making excuses, always blaming the system. But don't worry, I'll make sure the administration hears about this little stunt." She turned to the class, raising her voice theatrically. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. There are rules in this school, and if you don't follow them, there are consequences." Miss Carter reached down, gripping the torn edge of Amara's dress again, tugging it slightly as if to prove her point. Amara flinched. That was when something inside her finally broke. Tears spilled freely now, trailing down her cheeks as she shook her head. "Please stop," she whispered. "You're hurting me." The word hurting echoed in the room, but Miss Carter only laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Oh, stop being dramatic," she said. "This is exactly the problem, always overreacting, always looking for sympathy." She turned toward the classroom door. "I'm calling the principal. You can explain yourself to him and maybe security, since clearly you don't understand basic decency." The classroom door swung open just as Miss Carter reached for her phone. And then everything changed. A deep, calm voice spoke from the doorway. "That won't be necessary." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The room fell into a stunned silence so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed deafening. Miss Carter stiffened. Slowly, she turned around. Standing in the doorway was a tall black man in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding without effort. His hair was neatly graying at the temples, his expression composed, but his eyes told a different story. They were locked on Amara, and they were filled with barely contained fury. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Miss Carter said sharply, masking her unease with forced authority. "You can't just barge into my classroom." The man didn't look at her right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his shoes echoing softly against the floor as he crossed the room. Students watched with wide eyes, sensing something monumental unfolding in real time. He stopped beside Amara. Gently, so gently it made several students swallow hard, he removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders, carefully covering the torn fabric. His hand rested briefly on her back, steadying her. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked quietly. Amara nodded weakly, though her eyes brimmed with tears. "I tried to tell her, Dad," she whispered. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. "Dad." Miss Carter's face drained of color. She laughed nervously, waving a dismissive hand. "Sir, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but—" The man finally turned to face her. And when he did, Miss Carter's breath caught in her throat, because she recognized him, not from parent-teacher meetings, not from school fundraisers, but from newspapers. Court transcripts, Televised hearings, the seal on the lapel pin he wore, subtle, unmistakable, made her stomach drop. The man met her gaze, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "My name is Judge Marcus Johnson," he said. "Federal District Court." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Miss Carter took an involuntary step backward. Judge Johnson's eyes hardened as he gestured toward Amara's torn dress. "And I suggest," he continued evenly, "you explain to me right now why my daughter is standing in the middle of this classroom in tears." Miss Carter opened her mouth. No sound came out. Her mind raced, scrambling for control, for authority, for anything to anchor her. I was enforcing the dress code," she stammered. "She was being inappropriate, disruptive." Judge Johnson glanced around the room, taking in the frozen faces of the students, the phones half hidden under desks, the unmistakable tension hanging thick in the air. "Inappropriate," he repeated slowly. His gaze returned to Miss Carter, sharp, assessing, unyielding. "And you thought tearing a child's clothing in front of her peers was appropriate?" Miss Carter swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. Save it," he said quietly. The single word silenced her completely. Judge Johnson reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "You see," he said calmly, "I was invited here today to observe this school as part of a federal review on discriminatory disciplinary practices." Several students' mouths fell open. Miss Carter's knees visibly trembled. "And it seems," Judge Johnson continued, his voice steady but ice-cold, "that I arrived just in time." The bell rang suddenly, shrill and piercing. No one moved, no one breathed. Miss Carter stood frozen, staring at the man she had unknowingly humiliated in the worst possible way, at the power she had never imagined stood behind the girl she'd just torn apart in front of everyone. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a reckoning. But before we see how this ends, question of the day, have you ever been judged unfairly by someone in authority? How did it make you feel? Tell us your story in the comments below, and don't forget to let us know where you're watching from today. But before we see how this ends, let's go back to where this story truly began 3 months earlier. The morning sun crept softly through the thin curtains of a small but immaculately kept apartment on the east side of the city. Birds chirped faintly outside, mixing with the distant hum of traffic beginning its daily crawl. Inside the apartment, the smell of freshly brewed tea and lightly toasted bread filled the air. Amara Johnson stood in front of the narrow mirror in her bedroom, carefully smoothing down the front of her blue school dress. She had checked it 3 times already, once when she laid it out the night before, once after ironing it until every crease vanished, and once more now before daring to step out of her room. The dress was simple, long sleeves, hem well below the knee. Exactly as outlined in the school's official dress code handbook. Still, Amara's stomach twisted with anxiety. She tugged gently at the fabric, making sure it sat just right. Her dark hair was braided neatly, pulled back with a plain clip. No jewelry except for small silver studs her mother had given her on her 13th birthday. Perfect, careful, invisible. That's how Amara survived most days, by trying not to draw attention. "Amara, sweetheart," her mother called softly from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready." Amara took a deep breath and stepped out of her room. Her mother, Elena Johnson, stood by the small dining table, placing a plate of eggs and toast down with care. She wore her usual work clothes, a modest blouse and slacks, her hair pulled into a low bun. There were faint circles under her eyes, the kind that came from long nights and early mornings, but her smile was warm and reassuring. "You look beautiful," Elena said immediately. Amara managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." Elena studied her for a moment longer, her expression shifting subtly from pride to concern. "Is everything okay? You seem tense." Amara hesitated, then shrugged lightly. "It's just school stuff." Elena sighed softly, pulling out a chair for her daughter. "That teacher again?" Amara didn't answer right away. She sat down and picked at her toast, her appetite suddenly gone. "She keeps watching me," Amara finally said quietly. "Like she's waiting for me to mess up." Elena's jaw tightened, though she kept her voice calm. "Have you told your counselor?" "I tried," Amara replied. "She said Miss Carter is old-fashioned and that I should just keep my head down." Elena shook her head slowly, frustration flashing in her eyes. "Keeping your head down doesn't stop injustice, baby." Amara looked up at her mother. "Then why does it feel like it's all I'm allowed to do?" Elena reached across the table, squeezing Amara's hand. "Because some people are uncomfortable with brilliance they can't control, especially when it doesn't look like them." Amara swallowed. She'd heard versions of that sentence her entire life. At 14, Amara was already familiar with being the only one. The only black girl in advanced placement classes, the only student whose essays teachers double-checked for plagiarism, the only one asked if she was sure she belonged in accelerated math. Still, she loved learning. Books were her escape. Knowledge was her shield. She dreamed of becoming a civil rights attorney someday, someone who could stand up in rooms where voices like hers were usually ignored. And today mattered more than most days. Today was evaluation day. Once every semester, administrators sat in on random classes to observe student behavior and teacher performance. These evaluations determined recommendations, advanced programs, scholarships, leadership opportunities. Amara had been nominated by her guidance counselor for a prestigious academic summer institute. One recommendation letter, just one, could change her entire future. And unfortunately, that recommendation rested heavily on one person, Miss Evelyn Carter. Miss Carter had been teaching at Westbrook Preparatory Academy for over 20 years. She was known for her strict discipline, her no-nonsense attitude, and her reputation for keeping certain students in check. Parents whispered about her in hushed tones. Students feared her openly, but the administration trusted her. "She's tough because she cares," the principal often said. Amara wasn't so sure. From the very first day of class, Miss Carter had singled her out. "Is that how you speak at home? Do you need extra help understanding instructions? Try not to be so loud, Amara. This isn't a playground." No matter how quietly Amara spoke, no matter how perfectly she followed instructions, it was never enough. Still, she endured, because quitting wasn't an option. After breakfast, Amara slung her backpack over her shoulder and hugged her mother tightly. "Have a good day," Elena said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And remember, no matter what happens, you did nothing wrong." Amara nodded, holding on to those words as she stepped outside. The walk to school was only 10 minutes, but it felt longer that morning. Each step echoed with nervous anticipation. She replayed conversations in her head, rehearsed answers, imagined scenarios, most of them ending badly. Westbrook Preparatory Academy loomed ahead, its red brick facade polished and imposing. A banner near the entrance read, "Excellence through discipline." Amara adjusted her backpack straps and walked inside. The halls buzzed with chatter. Students laughed, shoved lockers shut, complained about homework. Teachers stood chatting near doorways. As Amara passed by, she heard a familiar voice. "Well, if it isn't our little scholar." Her shoulders tensed. Miss Carter stood near the doorway of room 214, arms crossed, eyes scanning Amara from head to toe. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Amara said politely. Miss Carter hummed, unimpressed. "Is that the same dress you wore last week?" "Yes, ma'am," Amara replied. "It's part of the uniform." Miss Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "We'll see about that." Amara's heart sank. She slipped into her seat near the front, setting her notebook down carefully. Around her, students whispered nervously. "She's on her again," someone murmured. Amara stared at her desk, willing herself to disappear. Minutes later, Miss Carter began the lesson, pacing slowly across the room. Her eyes kept drifting back to Amara, lingering, scrutinizing. Every time Amara raised her hand, Miss Carter ignored her. When Amara quietly corrected a mistake on the board, Miss Carter snapped. "Don't interrupt me." The tension built steadily like a storm gathering force. Amara could feel it in her chest. This day, this class was a test, and she was failing it in ways she couldn't control. When Miss Carter finally stopped mid-sentence and turned sharply toward her, Amara knew something was coming. "Stand up," Miss Carter ordered. The room went silent. Amara stood, hands clasped in front of her. "Turn around," Miss Carter said coldly. Confusion flickered across Amara's face, but she obeyed. Miss Carter circled her slowly like a predator assessing prey. "This," she said loudly, tugging slightly at the fabric near Amara's shoulder, "is inappropriate." "It meets the code," Amara said softly, her voice trembling. "I checked." Miss Carter's lips curled, and that was the moment everything spiraled toward disaster. The moment that would lead to the ripping sound, the humiliation, the reckoning. Amara had no idea yet, but this ordinary morning, this desperate attempt to stay invisible, was about to expose something far bigger than a torn dress. It was about power, and who was finally going to answer for abusing it. The air inside room 214 felt heavier than usual that morning, thick with unspoken tension. The kind of tension that made every shuffle of a notebook sound too loud, every cough feel like a disruption. Amara stood frozen at the front of the classroom. "Hands at your sides," Miss Carter ordered sharply. Amara hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. Her palms pressed flat against the seams of her dress, fingers trembling. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her back, some curious, some uncomfortable, a few almost eager. Miss Carter paced slowly around her, heels clicking with deliberate precision. "You see, class," Miss Carter said, turning theatrically to face the students, "there's a reason we have standards. When students start bending the rules, it creates chaos." She stopped behind Amara. "And some students," she added pointedly, "think the rules don't apply to them." Amara swallowed hard. "I followed the rules," she said quietly. "I swear." Miss Carter leaned in close, her breath warm against Amara's ear. "You people always swear," she whispered, low enough that only Amara could hear. "And you're always lying." Amara's chest tightened. A murmur rippled through the room. "Miss Carter," a boy near the window ventured nervously, "I think her dress looks fine." "Sit down, Jacob," Miss Carter snapped without even looking at him. "Unless you want detention." Jacob sank back into his seat, face flushed. Miss Carter straightened and raised her voice again. "This is what happens when we lower expectations. When we let certain behaviors slide in the name of inclusivity." The word inclusivity dripped with disdain. Amara felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying would only prove Miss Carter right, at least in her mind. "I'm not trying to break any rules," Amara said, her voice barely audible. "I just want to learn." Miss Carter laughed, a short, humorless laugh that echoed cruelly. "Oh, don't we all," she said, "but learning starts with discipline. And clearly discipline is something you lack." She reached out and pinched the fabric of Amara's dress near the shoulder. "See this?" she said loudly. "Too loose, too suggestive." Gasps erupted. "It's not," Amara began. Before she could finish, Miss Carter yanked. "Re-ip." The sound tore through the room like a gunshot. For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos. A girl in the front row covered her mouth in shock. Someone cursed under their breath. A chair scraped loudly as a student stood halfway before sitting back down, terrified. Amara stumbled back, clutching the torn fabric instinctively. "No, please," she whispered. Her heart hammered violently as she realized what had just happened. The classroom felt suddenly too bright, too exposed. Miss Carter dropped the torn piece of fabric as if it were trash. "There," she said coldly. "Problem solved." Amara's vision blurred as tears finally spilled over. "I didn't do anything wrong," she cried softly. Miss Carter crossed her arms. "Enough, you're disrupting my class." She turned toward her desk. "I'm calling the principal and security if necessary." The word security sent a fresh wave of fear through Amara. She imagined being dragged out of the classroom, whispered about for years, labeled as that girl. She shook her head desperately. "Please don't. I can just go to the restroom." "You will do as you're told," Miss Carter snapped. "Sit down and cover yourself. Cover yourself." As if this were Amara's fault. Amara looked around helplessly. No one moved, no one spoke, except one girl, Lily, sitting 2 rows back, who whispered, "This isn't right." Miss Carter's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Lily shrank back instantly, eyes wide with fear. "Nothing, ma'am," Miss Carter smirked, satisfied. "Thought so." She dialed her phone slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact with Amara. "This is exactly what happens," she said loudly, "when students come from backgrounds that don't value structure." That was when the classroom door opened. The interruption was subtle but powerful. Miss Carter turned sharply. "Who do you think you are interrupting?" Her words died in her throat. The man standing in the doorway was tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in a high school hallway. His presence commanded immediate attention, even without a word. "I believe that's my question," he said calmly. Miss Carter straightened, regaining her composure. "This is a private classroom. Parents are not allowed to just walk in." The man stepped forward, eyes locked on Amara. "Amara," he said softly, "come here." Relief and shock collided inside her. "Dad," she whispered. The room erupted in whispers. "That's her dad. Why is he here? Isn't that?" Judge Marcus Johnson removed his jacket and gently placed it around Amara's shoulders, shielding her from the stairs. Miss Carter laughed nervously. "Sir, I assure you this is all a misunderstanding. Your daughter was violating the dress code." Judge Johnson turned slowly to face her. "By tearing her clothing," Miss Carter's smile faltered. "I was correcting an issue." Judge Johnson's gaze swept the room. "Does anyone here believe this was appropriate?" Silence, but this time it wasn't fear, it was shame. Several students avoided eye contact. One girl nodded almost imperceptibly. Judge Johnson exhaled slowly. "I see," he said. Miss Carter scoffed. "Look, sir, with all due respect, you don't understand the challenges of maintaining order in a classroom like this." "Like this?" Judge Johnson repeated. Miss Carter hesitated. "You know," she said awkwardly, "with certain demographics." The word hung in the air. Judge Johnson's jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket and removed a badge. Miss Carter's eyes widened. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he said evenly. "Federal District Judge." A collective gasp filled the room. Miss Carter's face drained of color. "I'm here today," Judge Johnson continued, "conducting a review on discriminatory practices in public education." Miss Carter took a step back. "And it appears," he said, glancing at Amara, "I arrived at the perfect moment." Miss Carter opened her mouth, scrambling for words. I didn't know who she was," she stammered. Judge Johnson's eyes hardened. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely the problem." He pulled out his phone. "I think it's time we involved the administration," he added. Miss Carter's knees trembled. This was no longer a classroom issue. This was a reckoning, and she knew it. The room felt like it had lost its oxygen. Miss Carter stood rigid near her desk, one hand gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes darted from Judge Johnson's calm, unblinking stare to the students frozen in their seats, students who only moments ago had been silent witnesses and who were now potential evidence. She swallowed hard. "Judge Johnson," she said carefully, forcing a brittle smile. "I truly had no idea who your daughter was. If I had known—" Judge Johnson raised a single hand. "No," he said quietly. "Finish that sentence." Miss Carter hesitated. The silence stretched, suffocating. "If I had known," Judge Johnson repeated, his voice firm now, "you would have treated her with dignity." Her mouth opened, closed. "That's what you were about to say," he continued. "Which means you're admitting that the way you treated my daughter depends on who she belongs to." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the classroom. Miss Carter's face flushed. "That's not what I meant." "But it is what you revealed," Judge Johnson replied. He turned slightly, addressing the class now. "Did my daughter break the dress code?" Asked evenly, for a moment no one spoke. Then Lily, the same girl who had tried to speak up earlier, slowly raised her hand. "No, sir," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "She didn't." Judge Johnson nodded. "Thank you." Miss Carter spun toward Lily. "That's enough. Sit down, Miss Carter," Judge Johnson said sharply. The authority in his voice was undeniable, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. Miss Carter froze. "I said," he repeated, "sit down." Her lips parted in disbelief. For 20 years, no one had spoken to her like that in her own classroom. Slowly, shakily, she lowered herself into her chair. Judge Johnson walked to the center of the room. "I want all of you to listen carefully," he said. "What you just witnessed is not discipline, it is abuse of power." He gestured gently toward Amara. "My daughter is an honor student. She has never had a disciplinary incident in her life. Yet today she was humiliated, physically violated, and publicly shamed because a teacher decided she didn't belong." Amara felt tears well again, but this time they were different. Not just pain, validation. Miss Carter shook her head frantically. "This is being blown out of proportion. I was maintaining order." "Order?" Judge Johnson snapped, his calm finally cracking. "You ripped a child's clothing off her body." The word child echoed heavily. Judge Johnson pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "I've already contacted the principal," he said, "and the district superintendent." Miss Carter's breath hitched. "That's not necessary." "Oh, it is," he said coldly. "And for the record, this entire interaction is being recorded." He turned his phone so she could see the screen, recording. Miss Carter's eyes widened in horror. "You can't," she began. "I can," Judge Johnson replied, "and I have." A knock sounded at the door. Every head turned. The principal, Mr. Henderson, stepped inside, followed closely by 2 administrators and a uniformed school security officer. "Judge Johnson," Mr. Henderson said nervously, "we came as soon as we got your message." Judge Johnson nodded once. "You're just in time." Mr. Henderson's eyes fell on Amara, wrapped in her father's jacket, her face still wet with tears. "What happened here?" he asked, though his expression already suggested he feared the answer. Judge Johnson stepped aside slightly. "Perhaps," he said, "you should ask Miss Carter." All eyes turned to her. Miss Carter opened her mouth, but no words came out. The security officer shifted uncomfortably. There was a misunderstanding," Miss Carter finally stammered. "The student was violating the dress code, and I acted to correct it." Judge Johnson held up his phone. "Would you like me to play the recording?" he asked calmly. Mr. Henderson's face went pale. "No," he said quickly. "That won't be necessary." He turned to Miss Carter, his voice tight. "Evelyn, did you tear this student's dress?" Miss Carter looked around desperately. Students stared back at her, no sympathy, no support. "Yes," she whispered. "But that's enough," Mr. Henderson said sharply. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "This is unacceptable," he said. "Completely unacceptable." Miss Carter shot to her feet. "You can't seriously be taking his side without hearing mine." Judge Johnson met her gaze. "This is not sides," he said. "This is accountability." Mr. Henderson straightened. "Miss Carter, I am placing you on immediate administrative leave effective now." The words landed like a hammer. "What?" Miss Carter cried. "You can't do that." "I can," Mr. Henderson replied, "and I am." Her face twisted in disbelief, then rage. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I've dedicated my life to this school, one incident, one emotional parent, and suddenly I'm the villain." Judge Johnson stepped forward. "You made yourself the villain," he said quietly, "when you forgot your humanity." Miss Carter's shoulders sagged. "And this won't end here," Judge Johnson added. "I will be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Education and a civil rights investigation." Mr. Henderson's eyes widened. Miss Carter's knees buckled and she sank back into her chair. Amara watched silently, her emotions swirling, relief, exhaustion, disbelief. Judge Johnson turned to her, his voice softening instantly. "Amara," he said, "do you want to step outside for some air?" She nodded. As they walked toward the door, the class parted instinctively, students watching with awe and regret. At the doorway, Judge Johnson paused and looked back at the room. "I hope every one of you remembers this," he said evenly. "Not because of who I am, but because of who she is." Then they left. In the hallway, Amara finally broke down completely, sobbing into her father. "I tried so hard," she cried. "I did everything right." Judge Johnson held her tightly. "I know," he said softly, "and that's why this hurts so much." He pulled back slightly, wiping her tears gently. "But hear me, Amara," he said. "You did nothing wrong, nothing." She nodded, clinging to his words. Behind them, through the classroom door's small window, Miss Carter sat frozen, her world collapsing in silence. The truth had been revealed, and there was no undoing it. The hallway outside room 214 felt eerily quiet, as if the entire building had collectively decided to hold its breath. Amara sat on a bench near the counselor's office, her father beside her. The oversized suit jacket still draped around her shoulders, the fabric warm and grounding. She clutched it tightly, as though letting go might cause everything to unravel again. Judge Marcus Johnson kept one arm around her, his posture protective but gentle. Gone was the commanding presence that had frozen an entire classroom. In its place was a father, concern etched deep into his features. "You want some water?" he asked softly. Amara nodded. He handed her a bottle from his briefcase, watching closely as she took small sips. Her hands were still shaking. "I didn't think it would go that far," she whispered. "I just wanted her to stop." Judge Johnson closed his eyes briefly, pain flickering across his face. "People like her count on silence," he said quietly. "They count on children believing they have no voice." He looked at her with quiet pride. "You found yours today." A few minutes later, Mr. Henderson emerged from the classroom, his expression grim. "Judge Johnson," he said respectfully, "if you have a moment." Judge Johnson nodded and stood, squeezing Amara's shoulder reassuringly before following the principal a few steps away. "I want to apologize," Mr. Henderson began, "personally. And on behalf of the school." Judge Johnson listened, arms crossed. "What happened today was inexcusable," Mr. Henderson continued. "Miss Carter has been suspended pending termination. The district is launching a full investigation into her conduct." Judge Johnson's eyes hardened slightly. "This shouldn't be the first time concerns were raised about her behavior." Mr. Henderson hesitated. "There were complaints in the past." "From students of color?" Judge Johnson asked. Mr. Henderson didn't answer. He didn't have to. Judge Johnson exhaled slowly. "Then this is bigger than one teacher." Mr. Henderson nodded. "I agree. That's why the superintendent has ordered mandatory bias training for all faculty, and we're revisiting our disciplinary policies immediately." Judge Johnson studied him for a moment, then said, "Good, because if real change doesn't follow, I'll ensure it does, legally." Mr. Henderson swallowed. "Understood." Judge Johnson turned back to Amara. "Amara," Mr. Henderson said gently, crouching to her level, "I am so sorry for what you went through. No student should ever feel unsafe in our school." Amara looked at him, her voice soft but steady. "I just want to learn without being afraid." Mr. Henderson nodded solemnly. "You will." Later that afternoon, word spread through the school like wildfire. Students whispered in hallways. Teachers exchanged tense glances. Phones buzzed with messages and shaky video clips recorded before security intervened. By the time the final bell rang, everyone knew. Miss Evelyn Carter, the untouchable, had fallen. She was escorted out of the building quietly, her box of personal items clutched tightly to her chest. No one applauded, no one jeered, but no one defended her either. As she passed a group of students near the entrance, she overheard one of them whisper, "She finally got what she deserved." Miss Carter flinched. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt harsh. She paused on the steps, her reflection faintly visible in the glass doors behind her. For the first time in years, there was no authority to hide behind, only consequences. That evening, Amara sat at the kitchen table at home, her mother Alina holding her hands tightly. Alina's eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "They called me," she said. "The school, they told me everything." Amara nodded. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Alina pulled her into a fierce hug. "You didn't cause anything, you survived something." Judge Johnson watched them quietly from across the room. "I should have been there sooner," Alina said through tears. Judge Johnson shook his head. "This isn't on us, this is on a system that allowed it." Amara pulled back slightly. "Is she going to jail?" Judge Johnson chose his words carefully. "What she did was serious. There will be investigations. Laws exist for a reason." He paused. "But more importantly, this has started a conversation that can protect other kids." Amara thought about that. The next few weeks were a blur. News outlets picked up the story. Federal judge's daughter humiliated by teacher sparks civil rights investigation. Former students came forward. Parents demanded answers. The school board held emergency meetings. Miss Carter resigned before termination proceedings could conclude. Her teaching license was suspended pending review. For Amara, the attention was overwhelming, but something inside her shifted. Students she barely knew stopped her in the hallways. "Thank you," one girl whispered. "You were brave," said another. "My little brother is black," a boy admitted quietly. "I'm glad someone finally stood up." One afternoon, Lily approached her at her locker. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she said. "I was scared." Amara smiled gently. "I was too." They stood in silence for a moment. "You're really strong," Lily added. Amara blinked back tears. "I didn't feel strong." "That's usually how it works," Lily replied. At home, Amara began writing again, journals filled with thoughts, questions, anger, hope. One night, she handed her father a page. "I want to be like you," she said quietly. "I want to protect people." Judge Johnson read the page carefully, his eyes glistening. "You already are," he said. Months passed. New teachers replaced Miss Carter. Classrooms felt different, lighter, safer. Students spoke up more. Teachers listened more carefully. Change, slow but real, had begun. One afternoon, as Amara packed her bag, her counselor stopped her. "Amara," she said, smiling warmly, "I wanted you to know your recommendation for the Summer Institute was approved, unanimously." Amara's breath caught. "Really?" The counselor nodded. "They said your integrity and resilience stood out." Amara walked home that day feeling taller, stronger, seen. That night she stood in front of the mirror again, the same mirror from months ago. But this time she didn't check her dress for flaws. She looked herself in the eyes, and she smiled. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured through the tall windows of a modern courtroom in downtown Washington, D.C., casting long golden streaks across polished wooden benches. The room hummed softly with anticipation, law students, attorneys, families, and community leaders filling every seat. At the front row sat Amara Johnson, now 15, her posture straight, her expression calm but bright. She wore a navy blue blazer over a simple white dress, not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to. Beside her sat her mother, Alina, squeezing her hand gently. "You ready?" Alina whispered. Amara nodded, a small smile forming. "More than ready." At the front of the courtroom, Judge Marcus Johnson took his seat behind the bench. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the room, and for just a brief second his eyes met his daughter's. Pride flickered across his face. Today wasn't about a ruling. Today was about impact. The event was titled Youth Voices in Justice, a national program highlighting students whose experiences had sparked meaningful change in education, civil rights, and community policy. And Amara had been invited not as a victim, but as a voice. When her name was called, the room applauded. Amara stood, heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with purpose. She stepped to the podium, gripping its edges lightly as she looked out at the crowd. Faces stared back, attentive, respectful. She took a breath. 1 year ago, she began, her voice steady, I stood in a classroom feeling small, humiliated, and powerless. The room fell silent. I was made to believe that my body, my voice, and my presence were problems to be corrected. She paused. "But what I learned," she continued, "is that silence protects injustice, and speaking up, no matter how scary, can change things." Alina wiped away tears. Amara glanced briefly at her father, then back to the audience. "I'm not here because of who my dad is," she said firmly. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to thousands of students every year, and most of them don't have a judge for a parent." A murmur rippled through the room. "That's why change can't depend on who you know," Amara said. "It has to depend on who you are." When she finished, the room rose in a standing ovation. Judge Marcus Johnson stood last but longest. Later that evening, the Johnson apartment felt warmer than ever. Laughter filled the kitchen as Alina set dinner on the table. "You were incredible," Alina said. "I barely recognized you up there." Amara laughed softly. "I did." Judge Johnson joined them, loosening his tie. "You didn't just tell a story," he said. "You told the truth." "And that's what scares injustice the most," Amara smiled. "I think I want to be a civil rights attorney someday." Judge Johnson raised an eyebrow, amused. "You think?" They laughed together. Back at Westbrook, the walls looked the same, but the culture didn't. New posters lined the hallways. Respect is not optional. Every student deserves dignity. Speak up. We're listening. Mandatory bias training had become policy, not just at Westbrook, but across the district. Students now knew how to report mistreatment. Parents were involved. Administrators were accountable. Room 214 had a new teacher, Ms. Alvarez. On her first day, she stood before the class and said something Amara never forgot. "This classroom is a place of safety. No one will ever be humiliated here on my watch." Amara believed her. Miss Evelyn Carter now lived very differently. Her teaching license had been officially revoked. She worked a clerical job at a private tutoring center, under supervision, barred from working alone with children. The investigation into her conduct became part of statewide teacher training materials. Her name wasn't famous, but her actions were remembered, and she carried that weight every day. Sometimes accountability doesn't come with applause, it comes with reflection. Amara thrived. Her confidence grew. Her grades soared, not because she had changed, but because the environment finally had. She joined the debate team. She mentored younger students. She volunteered at a legal aid clinic with her father on weekends. One afternoon, a sixth-grade girl tugged on her sleeve. "They say you're the reason teachers don't yell anymore," the girl whispered. Amara knelt beside her. "No," she said gently. "I just reminded them we matter." That night, Amara stood once again in front of her bedroom mirror. But this time there was no fear, no shrinking, no checking herself for flaws. She stood tall because she knew something now, something no one could ever take from her again. Her worth had never been up for debate. Cruelty thrives in silence, but justice begins the moment someone says, "This is not okay." True power isn't about authority, it's about integrity. And dignity should never depend on who's watching. If this story moved you, please like this video to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who believes in fairness and courage. And subscribe to our channel for more powerful, inspirational stories that remind us every voice matters. Thank you for watching.